name is Andrés Cuervo, and this is my project Lace. Oh, okay, sorry. So hi, I'm Andrés Cuervo, and before I get into my whole spiel, a little bit about me. So I'm an AR prototyper, an HCI researcher, and an artist. And this is a collection of some of my more recent work. I've been doing VR narratives and VR art installations for a while. Most recently I've been doing AR tools for creativity, so things like 3D brushes. And the thing that all of these things have in common is basically screens. And I've spent a lot of my time in front of screens, and I've developed like an affinity for how ubiquitous they are, but I also think it's kind of ridiculous that they're sort of the only way that we have to interact with computation. So, for example, like we have really tiny screens, at least some people do, but most people have sort of middle-sized screens, and a lot of the world gets their work done on these ever larger personal screens that we hook up to monitors or TVs. And so screens are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you want the biggest screen possible, then you make a really tiny screen and you put it really close to your eyes. And like I said, I've done this work professionally, so like I appreciate and love that that's where we are with technology, but I am interested in speculative design, and specifically speculative interaction design. So in order to do that, you have to have a question to speculate on, and mine has been, what would a screenless world look like? There's a lot of really interesting answers to this. One of the sort of the clearest cut is something like the work that Team Lab has been doing in Tokyo. So they have a bunch of different installations, but this one's really interesting in that it has little critters made out of flowers, and they're projection mapped to the floor and to a tree in the middle of the installation. And they actually interact not only with the other projections, but also with like any participants running through the screen, through the area. So Team Lab is sort of one vision for this future, and to understand how we get to mine, we have to understand some of my inspirations. So the oldest is probably Ivan Sutherland's 1963 thesis, which was this sketchpad system. So this was built on an early light display, and it looks remarkably similar to things like Adobe Illustrator that we have today, or even Sketch. And I think one of the most interesting properties that it had was this idea of constraint programming. So that means a lot of different things, but this is sort of the easiest to understand, which is you could draw whatever shape you want and then specify, okay, this is a closed shape, and I want to turn certain lines horizontal and certain lines vertical. And there was this sort of symbiosis between designing for humans and designing for computers. I think the next, sort of jumping forward 30 years, the next most relevant thing was really all of Muriel Cooper's work, but specifically her last piece, which was information landscapes. This is a collection of like 3D text and data visualizations, but the thing that you don't get just from these static images is that you could sort of like use a trackball or your keyboard to zoom into any of these scenes in full 3D. That was a really interesting exploration. One really sort of really influential modern last inspiration is Dynamic Land, and I think there's a lot going on the screen, but I think it's all summed up by this piece at the bottom, which is a humane dynamic medium that gently leads people down a path from playing to crafting to remixing to programming. So you can see that they're using projectors, and their programs are represented as these pieces of paper. The paper and the projections are really interesting, and they definitely like embody this Team City example, or Team Lab example that I gave earlier. But I think the important part about Dynamic Land is that it treats computation as like a medium that we can live in, which is really interesting. And then the final sort of most reminiscent thing for me, especially because it looks so much like Sketchpad from 50 years ago, is this system called ChalkTalk, which comes out of Ken Perlin's lab at NYU. And so you have I think they have over 70 of these sort of gestures. So this one, for example, is you draw a line horizontal and vertical, and then you make a circle, and that gives you this little pendulum. And you can actually extend the pendulum, or you can move around the ball, and you can even do stuff like this in 3D. And so it's definitely the most reminiscent for me of the sort of future that I want. But I want it disconnected from this sort of 2D display screen input. So all of that is inspiring this thing that I'm calling LACE, which is an interactive installation that uses projected light and hand gestures to imagine a world where interactive technology feels like play. And that's a lot of words, so it's easier to just show you. I kind of jerry-rigged a projector onto a tripod, and even though this is kind of mirroring a screen that's just running on my laptop screen, I think I can call this good enough for screenless technology, at least for what's available like on the commercial market. So I used open frameworks to create graphics, and I used Elite Motion for hand detection, and this model projector, and that all came together with, so this is actually without even Elite Motion. This is the first thing that I built, and this is just a little red dot that's following my mouse. And the thing that's most magical about this example, I think, is that it transfers seamlessly from like just living on the trackpad all the way to my hand. And it crawls up my arm and stuff, and it's really interesting. And so that got me really motivated to attach a leap to it, and that gave me access to hands. And so I started creating volumetric displays, volumetric projections with them. And so if there's only one hand, it would pin to the center. And if there's two hands, then I could create a box in between both of my hands. And that was even though it was displayed in 2D, it felt really natively 3D in this sort of strange way. And so the current state of the project is I have this drawing experience, and you whenever you pinch, you can append to this line, and in certain lighting conditions, the black sort of fades away in the background, and so the brightest thing in the scene is just what you've been drawing. And it's really responsive right now, but I want to make it sort of more intuitive to interact with. And you'll see in a second that the line is, even though it's projected right here in 2D, it's actually recorded in 3D. So I want to eventually be able to do stuff like turn this into an actual volume, or be able to 3D print it or something. And so eventually I want this system to be like composed of multiple experiences, and I want it to sort of speak for itself and be as natural as interacting with an iPad or an iPhone or any normal desktop application. And eventually, in order to do that, I think I need to overcome a bunch of these challenges, and one way that I'm thinking about solving a lot of them is by creating a self-explanatory narrative around the whole experience. So that will solve things like making it intuitive, making it explain itself, and also sort of giving a catch for creating a natural gesture interface. This is what I'm thinking in terms of the timeline, and I think it'll sort of snowball as I build more experiences. I hope that's true. And yeah, that's it.
Are there any questions for Andrés about LACE, the hand gesture projection interaction piece? Anybody? I think it's very cool. All right. Oh yeah, there's one in the back. We'll go all the way over there.
Andrés, yeah, this does look really cool. I hope I get to play with it. What for you is the difference between using a screen and projecting something onto a flat surface? Is that something you see changing, or yeah, what are the differences you see there?
Yeah, so the stuff that I've built so far isn't even projection mapped. It's really just like a projected screen, and so the projector adds this element of like being able to sort of bend around anything that I pointed at, including like my hands or any household object that's on the table. And so I think that's what's like more special about projection, even if you're just mirroring two displays.
One more.
So I was just curious, like in this screenless future that you're imagining, I mean, there's still some sort of device, right, like tracking motions and things like that. I mean, does that remain personal, or is that something that's maybe like, I don't know, public or privately owned in some way?
Yeah, so it all comes down to sort of privacy and like how we all agree to interact with privacy. That's all to say, like there is probably a future where either if you like trust the system enough, then you can sort of have your own personal slice of a projection. And realistically, for some applications, you probably won't trust anything that has access to the community. And so yeah, you'll have a little phone, tablet, or something. But I think ideally, it would be ideal if we could get to the point where everything was sort of shared by default, and that sort of having a personal application that's displayed with personal technology is sort of like the exception to the rule.
Thank you, Andres. Let's give you one more round of applause.